Lant is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development and a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School, where he's taught from 2000 to 2004 and from 2007 onward. Before joining the Kennedy School, he was lead socioeconomist in the Social Development Group at the South Asia region of the World Bank. So he spent a lot of time there. He occupied various other positions at the bank during his tenure since 1988. He was a team member on a number of prominent World Bank publications, including Economic Growth in the 1990s, Learning from a Decade of Reforms, then the World Development Report 2004, Making Services Work for Poor People, Assessing Aid, What Works, What Doesn't, and Why, with David Dollar in 1998, and Infrastructure for Development, the World Development Report 1994. He's published 2 books with Center for Global Development, Let Their People Come in 2006, and now what we're going to hear today, which is The Rebirth of Education. It's forthcoming. Professor Pritchett's published over 100 articles and papers with more than 25 co-authors on a wide range of topics, including state capability, labor mobility, and education, among others. He's originally from Idaho and the father of 3 children, and now lives in an empty nest with his wife of 31 years in Chennai, India. So thank you, Lant, and welcome.
Thanks for having me here. The title, Rebirth of Education, has special significance. As 2 hours ago, I became a grandfather for the first time.
Oh, wow.
My middle son. Yeah, grandfather, by the way, is the easiest way to get applause of all. You do nothing, or you did something many years ago, and it eventually pays off. So my middle son had a baby boy at 7 pounds, 11 ounces, literally 2 hours ago. So birth is turns out, a pregnant metaphor. So I'm going to give some simple messages with the acknowledgement that they're increasingly insane. And insane in a deep and important way, but insane nonetheless. What I'm going to argue is that what started as a drive for universal education became perverted into a drive for universal schooling, and the component of education, that some children actually acquire life skills that they needed while in school, became an undermeasured, underemphasized, and ultimately neglected component of the schooling experience, such that we now have achieved universal schooling with unbelievably low levels of education. So, second, I want to make the claim that more of the same, that is, more of the successful coalition of advocacy that brought us to universal schooling will likely replicate more of the same. As Einstein said, the definition of insane is doing the same thing and expecting different results. Which means that we have a deep problem that in many countries of the world, the ecosystem into which schooling organizations are embedded encourages isomorphic mimicry that actually blocks the emergence of learning-driven schools. So, now, why is this insane? Well, this is insane because kids are so damn cute. And there is nothing that sells a book like kids in a classroom on a cover. And there is no advocacy. If you have ripped off people for billions of dollars on Wall Street and want to rehabilitate your image, what do? You donate to schools, right? Schooling is the most successful institutional transformation of the last 100 years. It has become completely unassailable, and I am going to attack it head on. In that, not that it was a failure, but that it was a success, and now it needs to dramatically pivot its focus in a way that's extremely difficult, especially for successful movements and institutions to do. So, schooling, so this is the first of kind of some exercises for the reader. Here is the average schooling years of adults in 3 different countries. One of them is France in 1960, one of them is Bangladesh in 2010, and one of them is Haiti in 2010. And this is the average years of schooling. And I'll give you some hints. France in 1960 had a GDP of 10,000. Haiti and Bangladesh today have GDPs per capita of about 1,500, only about a sixth as much. France in 1960 already had an infant mortality rate that was down well into an extended demographic transition of 28. I think I just flipped these, sorry about that. Haiti has 175, Bangladesh has 47. So dramatically less developed places, Bangladesh and Haiti today, compared to what France was in 1960. France in 1960 was still a global civilization. So what do you think the years of schooling are? Any guesses? I'm going to pick on you because you sat inadvertently right here. Who is who?
I'm assuming 5.8 is France. And Haiti is 5.2. Bangladesh the lowest.
Okay. You got it exactly backwards. So this is Bangladesh, this is Haiti, this is France. Today in the world, the developing countries, on average, have gone from having 2 years of schooling in 1950 to having on average 7.2 years of schooling today. So the most successful thing that has happened in my lifetime is an expansion to universal schooling. Nearly everywhere in the world, nearly every child starts school, and most children in nearly every place in the world at least get through primary schooling. So the average years of schooling of developed countries today is already well above what the average of the developed countries was even in the 1960s and almost into the 1970s. So, and the success in the expansion of schooling has been amazingly uniform across countries. So you might think, oh yeah, good countries have expanded schooling, but bad countries haven't. You would be wrong. You would be completely wrong. So if we compare the gains in schooling from 1950 to 2010, and we compared the most democratic third of countries to the least democratic third of countries, we had more expansion in the least democratic third. If we compared the most third corrupt to the least third corrupt, we had almost exactly the same expansion in the most and least corrupt countries. If we compared the most free and the least free, we had exactly the same expansion in the most free and the least free. So kind of, you know, Guatemala now has universal enrollment, as does Costa Rica. Costa Rica got there a little sooner, but kind of, you know, you might say, well, we can understand how Costa Rica got to universal schooling, but of course Guatemala didn't. No, Guatemala has too, right? I mean, I pick on Guatemala as being, well, we won't say. And by the way, this comes around more to South Asia as we go. So here's another question for the audience. So the first question is not a trick question. Just if you encountered this on an entrance exam, how would you answer it? How much of this figure is shaded? Okay. That's not the question I want to ask the audience. The question I want to ask the audience is, and let's see if my builds work, what percent of fourth graders in Andhra Pradesh answer this question correctly? So now think about fourth grade. You know, you're kind of 11 years old. You've been in school 4 years by definition. But then do you think 15%, 30%, 45%, 60, or 75% of fourth graders answer that question correctly?
75%.
What?
75.
15.
That's a guess. 75. What would you guess?
15.
15. What would you guess? What?
30?
Okay, we're getting distributions. What would you guess? 30. Okay. We've got an strikingly informed audience here, because I think most people would think this is the kind of question that you shouldn't be in fourth grade and not be able to answer. I mean, it's just understanding that you can divide an object into 4 parts and a fourth part is a fourth, right? But it's 30%. So only about 1 in 3 of fourth graders can get this question right. If we look at, here's another kind of exercise. So I'll tell you the fact, which is in an assessment across 18 states of India, the question, how long is the pencil in this picture? Only 23% of fourth graders got it right. So we think, okay, fourth graders, they're young. Now think of eighth graders. They've persisted through 4 more years of schooling. They're now, in their teens. And this question, if you can't answer this question, you don't understand the concept of length and measurement. Right? Okay. So how many more got it right? What percent got it right? And hence, how many more percent got it right after 4 more years of schooling and persisting to 8th grade? Because lots of people dropped out, too. I mean, presumably the kids for whom school was more difficult already out of the system. So this is kids who have made it. So guesses on this one. I'm going to pick on you in the pink.
35.
35, which meant, you realize what you're saying, is that in 4 years of schooling, only 1 out of 9 additional kids, is that 1 out of 9? About 1 out of 8 additional kids learned to answer that question correctly. Any other guesses? Guess. 45? So kind of about half of 8th graders can answer that question. Despite of the fact they're in 8th grade, they're very near kind of terminal end of what would be compulsory schooling in India, right? Or not even that it's compulsory, but they're nearing, okay. Correct answer, 35%. Which means, per year of schooling, only 3 percentage points of kids kind of gained the ability to answer that super simple question right. So the consequence, and I'm going to use this phrase unfortunately many times, it's even worse than you think. Because so far, I've been giving you questions that are kind of rote. That kind of, if you just understood directly exactly what had been taught in class and could replicate directly exactly that on an exam, you'd be able to answer it right. So that's rote learning, mechanical. If we look at conceptual questions, we find unbelievably lower performance. So, or I don't know, unbelievably or not, this question is actually your ability to multiply. Right? And you have to be able to multiply and you have to be able to carry a little bit because 4 times 3 is 12. So you have to have some algorithm for carrying across place. And about half of 8th graders, I think, get this question right. By the way, everything I'm presenting is in the book, so with more data sources and stuff. So you think, oh, kids can multiply. Or at least half of kids can multiply. But then you ask this question, which is, 25 times 18 is more than 24 times 18. How much more? Now, if you think about this question for a little bit, if you don't understand this question, you don't actually understand multiplication. Because multiplication is repeated addition. So if I've added up 24 18s and then I add to 25 18s, how much larger is the answer? Well, it's got to be 18 larger. Right? Moreover, you could have answered this question by brute force multiplying these out and subtracting, but you should have been able to see, if you understood multiplication on even a rudimentary conceptual level, that it's repeated addition, this would have been an easy question. Strikingly, about half get this right with no prompts. They actually have to write in the answer. This one has multiple choice. So if you just guessed, you should expect about 25% get it right, and only 21% get it right. So, so less than, less than random guessing, conceptual mastery of the notion that multiplication is repeated addition, right? Similarly, the same sort of thing. If we ask, what's the perimeter of the shape and give them the adequate information, about half of them can do it. But if we ask them a conceptual question where we, take a wire, we bend into a rectangle, right? Even moderately kind of out of your usual context, right, it goes down again to well less than random guessing in terms of number of kids that get it right, including on a kind of assessment, if you just take the same addition problem and take it from columns in which they normally see it and put it in a row, the fraction that get the question right drops by 40 percentage points. So a simple row addition, where you've just written in a row, less than 10% of fourth graders in Andhra Pradesh can answer that question, whereas half of them could do multiple digit addition if you stacked it in that way. So in other words, even the modest amount of demonstrated learning is on an extraordinarily thin basis to where a lot of it's completely rote. So the result of that is that if you test, this is a distribution of, say, scores of Denmark on a PISA exam, and a distribution on the same exam of kids actually with a year more of, of the same kids, 15-year-old in Tamil Nadu, which is widely, if not correctly regarded, having just lived there for a year, widely, if not correctly regarded as one of the more advanced states of India, and then compare the scores, well, the result of not learning anything for a long time is you don't know anything at the end. So 15-year-olds in Tamil Nadu, the PISA characterizes levels, and level 1 is their lowest level of learning, right? Which means below this level, our test doesn't even characterize their performance because it's outside of the range of the test with which our instrument for testing has sort of reliability and validity. Half the kids don't reach level 1, which is only happens for 5% of Danish kids at the same age, right? So, you know, if placed in a Danish classroom, kind of the typical child in Tamil Nadu would be in the like far, far tail of the distribution. Second, the consequence of this kind of distribution is that there's essentially no one in the upper tail. I mean, literally in the sample in Tamil Nadu, there was literally no one in the upper tail. So if we take kind of the global top 10%, which have level 5 mastery of mathematics, which is roughly the global top 10%, you know, Denmark, advanced country, has about 11% there, and, you know, no matter how you add up the data, I'm sure there is some child in Tamil Nadu in that level. I mean, it's not exactly 0, but, you know, to first order, estimated as a distribution, you're now, well, I mean, you're now kind of in the 5th standard deviation, aren't you? How many times do I have to go from 350 to 600 at a standard deviation of 70? Anyway, there's just nobody up there because the average levels of learning are so low and the distribution's actually compressed enough that even though one thinks, well, the system might be producing some kids kind of in the upper tail, in actual samples of 1,000 or 2,000 or so, there was not a single child in that range. So, what that means, and by the way, all these little artwork things are part of the book to illustrate each point I make with a cartoon. So I'm trying to be learning appropriate. I've had multiple modes of learning. You know, some people like graphs. Everybody likes cartoons. So basically, we kind of had the notion that if we expanded schooling, it would open opportunity. But that was on the premise that you learned something, that there was a learning profile. So your education increased with your years of schooling, and kind of you would be prepared for the world. There's chairs over here. You would be prepared for the world and the challenges you would face as an adult once you emerge from having completed enough schooling, right? And that just is demonstrably, factually, wildly not true in South Asia today. Kids who are completing basic schooling have learned from shockingly little to absolutely nothing. Kind of that's the range, and there's of course a few people, many of whom are in this room, that are the exceptions to that rule, and with 1 billion people you're going to produce enough exceptions to have a lot of people in this room. But that doesn't belie the statistical fact that those people are like just amazing outliers, and the core of the educational system has now accomplished the objective of nearly universal enrollment and nearly universal completion of primary schooling moving on increasingly to completion of basic schooling, but the learning profile is just too damn flat for that schooling to have produced anything like an adequate education. So, first. Second, the consequence, and the second consequence is that if you think about a learning profile, which is how much you're learning per year or what fraction of kids, I mean, causally we want to think about how much an individual kid learns, and so the learning trajectory of an individual kid, but we can kind of think of a cohort of how much kid, you know, how mastery goes up. And these are actual learning trajectories of actual kids followed over 4 waves. Kind of what happens is the learning profile means about 1 in 6 kids who like start a year of schooling without a skill acquire it in the year. So if you can't read at grade 2 level starting 3rd grade, chances are about 1 in 6 that you'll have it at the end of 3rd grade, about 1 in 6 you'll have it at the end of 4th grade, which means if we, and even worse on even modestly conceptual things, so we just ask ourselves the question, well, what if at the existing efficacy of the learning profile we just kept kids in school longer to get better mastery, right? Problem is you can walk a long ways out a shallow ramp and not be very high. So just the, you know, so if we do this calculation, you know, for the mathematics, for the language tests on the educational initiatives exam, when we look at, like, how long would it take before we had 90% mastery of skills that were widely regarded as being 4th grade skills, you would have, at the observed pace of learning between 4th, 6th, and 8th grade, you'd have to stay in school 19 years before you got 4th grade mastery. And again, it makes sense. If you just don't learn a lot from year to year, you can walk out. So now, in the book, I produce some kind of graphs that illustrate this. That sort of, this is data from Ghana, but you sort of, these are things I invented. These are 2-sided normal distributions. And the size in each of these things is the fraction of a cohort by what grade they completed as their highest grade. So 8% of the cohort had no schooling, 35% had 9 or higher, and then this was the distribution. So these onions represent the proportions of a cohort. So if we say how many of a cohort have the skills mastery they will need for the rest of their life at age 15, it depends on what grade they attained and how much they learned per grade, right? So then we can think of 3 scenarios. One, let's just say we pushed all these kids who quit before grade 9 into grade 9, but we were pushing them up the same ramp. How high up the ramp would we be, right? The second thing we could imagine is, let's say we don't worry so much about pushing kids this way. Let's just steepen the ramp. How many more kids would be above this low international threshold, which is Tim's equivalent score of 420, which puts you kind of in the 10th percentile of OECD students. So this would be like remedial OECD student would score about 420, right? So in Ghana in 2007, only 10% of their kids were at the level of the bottom 10% of an OECD kid, right? Okay, and well, this is easy. Once you lay it out, it's easy to do, easy to see. If we push all these kids up a short ramp, the average is still 335 on an exam that's normed to OECD of 500 mean, which means we've only gone up 10 percentage points. The essence of this graph is the area of this onion above this graph is the fraction that are above the threshold. So visually you can see by pushing to universal completion of grade 9, at grade 9 we still only have about 20% of kids above a very low international threshold. So not that there isn't, you know, and again, not that there isn't some gain of getting kids to complete grades 6, 7, and 8, but at a low learning profile it's just not that big. Whereas if we could steepen the profile from its existing, and this is hand-drawn obviously, so kind of its existing to be a student standard deviation higher at grade 9 completion, we actually go from 9% to 31% above the international threshold. So there's more mileage in gain on learning goals when the learning profile is flat to to steepening the profile than there is to pushing out it. Again, we're not into the insane parts. This is kind of just background, right? This is just math. This is just simple arithmetic, kind of. So the point being, what the the currently popular kind of proposals, many of the currently popular proposals for schooling are to expand the number of places in junior secondary schools. So now that we've got primary, let's build lots more places in grades 7, 8, and 9. But, it's just learning per year is just too low for this kind of to make much difference in the actual distribution of kids who emerge from schooling equipped for life. Because it's just, so not that I'm, not that I'm against it, but let's just be clear that if you haven't learned a ton by grade 5, grades 6, 7, and 8, you're going to learn a little bit. You're not going to learn a ton more. Okay, so now I want to go. Now I want to go. I'm building towards the crazy, right? And sorry to the cameraman, I keep walking across like he told me not to. He said I could stay over there, I could stay in the middle, but I shouldn't walk across. So I'm going to go back here. Okay. Okay. So now I want you to think about things that require kind of thin and thick organizational capability. What do I mean by thin? Kind of if you think of delivering the mail. Everything a postman should do is encapsulated in an address. If a postman gets anything, everything he needs to know about that is encapsulated in a few bits of information, literally a few bits of information. And his role in the organization is just to respond appropriately to those bits. And if that works, mail gets delivered, right? Doesn't matter whether the package is from your grandmother and contains pictures. Doesn't matter whether the package is a letter offering you a job. Just nothing about the situation matters to successful accomplishment of the task other than the encapsulated address, right? These I call thin, and the implementation capability required to carry out thin tasks I call logistics. If you can do logistics, you can deliver the mail, right? Then there's things that are thick activities. And what do I mean by thick? What my best example for thick is marriage. Marriage is a thick engagement between two individuals. Anytime two married couples try and reduce kind of some dispute to thin criteria, like who did the dishes on which nights at which times, you know they're in trouble. Because they're attempting to reduce a thick, contextualized, dynamic relationship to a set of thin rules, right? That usually ends up by invoking other rules, handled by lawyers. So thick implementation, I call organizational capability intensive, right? And curative care. If I want a bunch of doctors out there responding to each individual patient according to each individual patient's kind of symptoms, I got to have an organization that creates in those doctors the motivation to engage in this thick process of engaging with patients, right? They can't just reduce what they do to, I'll do the same thing all the time. Counseling, policing, and teaching. Teaching is a quintessentially thick activity. It requires that the teacher respond to what is going on with the individual child and with the aggregate of children into a classroom. But kind of, if you're not doing it, if you're not doing thick responsiveness, it can't be scripted, right? So what I want you to do, here's another kind of exercise for the audience. So I want you to put up here a visual image of your best teacher. You all have been in a lot of schooling. Sometime you've had a good teacher, somebody you liked, inspired you, motivated you, you learned a lot from, right? Some of you, I mean, hopefully, you've had a best teacher. Now imagine your worst teacher. And again, I'm even more confident you've had a worse teacher. Okay? So now with those visual images, I want you to start trying to list what are the thin characteristics. Are there any thin characteristics that differentiated between those two teachers?
Showing up.
Showing up. There, that's a thin characteristic. There you go.
Completing paperwork.
Hmm?
Completing paperwork.
Completing paperwork. Okay.
Knowing the content knowledge.
Knowing the content knowledge is a little less thin, because it actually requires a pretty detailed assessment of what they know. It's not thin like age, gender, degrees. But I would assert that you're going to have a very, if we did this around the room, kind of the thin characteristics aren't going to be very sharply differentiated between your best and your worst. Your best and your worst might have been the same gender, same age, had degrees of the same type, both had a master's degree, both had a bachelor's degree. What it mostly, and there are some things like, for the worst teacher particularly, not showing up, right? Now, all I'm trying to get into your head is why regressions don't work, right? Regressions don't work for explaining performance of schools because they're really good at capturing thin characteristics. And thin characteristics are a tiny fraction, not zero, but small fraction of what differentiates good and bad learning environments. So it turns out this thought experiment has been replicated literally tens of thousands of times. It's like, I'm going to set this chair there so when I go to walk across, it will at least remind me to not do that. So literally there's been thousands of empirical studies that attempt to associate thin characteristics. Do people show up? What are their ages? What are their degrees? What are their years of training? What are their years of seniority? How many books does the school have? Does the school have a roof? Blah, blah, blah. So I call these emisvisible. I call them emisvisible because it rhymes, and rhyming is super important, I have learned over the years. I learned probably very early in elementary school that rhyming was important because you learn all kinds of things by rhyming it, right? So emisvisible just means education management information system. We can create an education management system that's a computer and has a form that people fill out and they key in the data. Those are the things that are visible to an emis system. They're thin, right? If I can type it into a computer, it's thin, okay? So what we know from decades of research of all kinds, at all levels, using all techniques, is that the emisvisible has very low explanatory power in explaining learning performance across any level. Across students, across schools, across districts, across regions, across provinces, across countries. The emisvisible, again, I'm not asserting that it's zero, it's just small, right? Okay. When we confront a system, an education system with the fact that students aren't learning, what do they do? If they're a government system, they respond like governments respond, of let's create a plan of expanding emisvisible inputs. That's just what they do. I mean, and most of them do it by promising to spend the most money on the inputs we know with most certainty are the least intrinsically important at augmenting learning in business as usual ways. Meaning, they spend a lot of money in hiring more teachers to reduce class size when we know for sure that if teachers aren't doing a good job anyway, more of them don't matter. Not that teachers don't matter, not that class sizes don't matter, but in the contingent sense that if the teacher isn't teaching anyway, hiring more of them won't matter. And that's where nearly all the budget goes. So there's almost a complete disjunction between how the typical response of a government system would be to a crisis in learning. They would admit we have a crisis in learning, and then what they would do is they would mount an EMIS visible input expansion as their response to a learning crisis. And by the way, I'm describing what India did, right? Literally. I don't know nearly as much about Pakistan and Bangladesh, but so, you know, the impact of that is going to be something, but not a lot. So part of what the book tries to emphasize is that developing countries aren't like a little ways from having adequate education. They're a long ways from having adequate education. So if we think of international exams like PISA or TIMSS, which are scaled norm 500, student standard deviation 100, they're more likely to be 200 points from an OECD education than to be 50 points. And 100 is like the Latin American countries are typically 100, the South Asian countries, and India is the only one that has been bold enough to actually do a comparable exam and then only have 2 states. They're more like 180 points away, okay? So then ask yourself, what I do in the book is I say, give me your EMIS fantasy, right? Take your EMIS list of inputs. Girls' toilets, adequate textbooks arriving on time, all classroom, you know, multiple classrooms, class sizes of 20. Give me your EMIS fantasy, right? And then say, let's match that with the empirical evidence of how much that increases learning, and say, how much would, you know, if we did your EMIS fantasy, how much further, how much higher would learning be with the evidence that we have about the incremental impact of expanding these inputs? And again, it wouldn't be 0, but, you know, when we do this with regression-based estimates, what we find is EMIS fantasies get you about 1/10 of a student's standard deviation. And again, that's not nothing. You know, I don't want to get into something, inputs don't matter. Yeah, inputs matter, sure they matter. They just don't matter nearly enough to be considered the dominant and exclusive response to a learning crisis. They're just not going to get you anywhere near. And again, I can do this all day, right? I mean, I can show you this across countries, spending per student and scores, and say if Mexico, you know, if Mexico had 5 times the per student spending at the existing efficacy of spending, it would go up, you know, towards the OECD mean by 10 points of the 100-point gap. Again, not nothing, but, and we can imagine what cost effectiveness would be. Of course, 5 times is ludicrous, you know, it's like fiscally impossible. And here I use microdata and just say, let's take every input in the EMIS fantasy, let's push it to the EMIS level that would be your fantasy level. You know, we're not going to put class sizes to 0, but we'll push class sizes to 20, right? You still get 1/10 of a student standard deviation total impact, right? So which means that, like, the inputs just don't add up to a strategy. So again, if we think of, we're going to steepen the learning profile by sticking stuff underneath to steepen it, it's going to work a little bit, but these wedges, each individual wedge of like the different elements of EMIS visible, things like infrastructure, inputs, you know, teacher training, etc., at their current efficacy with which we assess them, they're all too thin. And which roughly corresponds to what's gone on in India in the last decade or so, is through SSA and other ways, massive ramp up of inputs. And here is the only available time series data on performance in like fraction of kids that can read a grade 2 story and fraction of kids who can divide suggest, if anything, learning outcomes are getting worse. And we can debate, like, are they statistically significantly worse or da-da-da-da, but there's no evidence anywhere that things have gotten better, even though it is demonstrably the case, since India has mounted a really effective EMIS system, that we can show that all the EMIS inputs have gone up. Just massive improvements in the reported and almost certainly real levels of EMIS inputs. So thousands of girls' toilets have been built, thousands of school walls have been constructed, you know, thousands, millions, you know, everything at India is at scale, okay? So each thing I'm doing is a ramp up in the insaneness level, okay? So, the first wasn't so insane. I'm just telling you kids aren't learning anything. Second wasn't so crazy. I'm telling you expanding school is not going to help that much. You can maybe buy that. Third, I'm telling you is what every single education ministry in the world is doing won't work. This is what they are all doing. When they say we have a plan to address school equality, what they mean is we have a plan for expanding EMIS visible inputs. I'm telling you the dominant, if not exclusive, plan of most formal education ministries around the world won't work. That's getting pretty crazy. Now I'm saying there's a danger that it's worse than that in the sense that isomorphic mimicry can actually be a force that impedes one taking necessary changes. What is isomorphic mimicry? Isomorphic mimicry comes from the world of biology in which you can gain survival value by pretending to be something you're not. So if you look at those two snakes, one of them, the coral snake, is super poisonous and will kill you. One of them isn't poisonous at all, right? But if you saw either of those two snakes, you would avoid them, right? Now, I mean, probably you would avoiding all snakes is probably a good strategy, because what am I to know which is a dangerous snake? Moreover, having seen this lecture, right, and you knew there's a poisonous red, yellow, and black snake, you could do one of two things. You could remember red and black, friend of Jack, red and yellow, kill a fellow, which is anomic because if the red touches the black, it's actually harmless. If the red touches a yellow, it's poisonous. So whoa, red and yellow, oh. Red and, oh man. Okay. Now, organizations, particularly governmental organizations, have mastered isomorphic mimicry in that they realize is if we appear to be engaged in processes of quality improving reform, we cannot improve learning for decades upon decades and not be any the worse off for it. In other research that I've done, we've talked a lot about isomorphic mimicry, and like James Scott's famous book, Looking Like a State, we call this looking like a school. If you look like a school, you gain all the survival value of actually being an educational organization. Meaning, if we buy more desks, if we hire more teachers, if we make the teachers have higher levels of formal qualifications, if we have fewer students per classroom, if we have better looking textbooks, if we engage in the process of doing this, right, we call this a technique of successful failure. You can succeed in garnering all the legitimacy you need to survive and all the budget you need and educational cesses and more budget and more prestige without ever actually delivering on the functional agenda that you exist to do, right? And the key thing is just to make isomorphic mimicry identical with performance, such that, and this is now tragically in my view, enshrined in Indian legislation. There's an Indian thing called the Right to Education Act that entitles every child to a quality education. What does it mean legally by quality education? It means that you have the EMIS visible inputs in place. Completely. So, isomorphic mimicry is actually extremely dangerous because it can fill the ecosystem space for thriving productive organizations with dysfunctional organizations who survive and dominate the ecosystem persistently, decade after decade after decade. So it is likely the case that learning per year in India has not gone up in 20 or 30 years. I mean, we only know because we only started measuring it 10 years ago, but it's just so unbelievably low now, and the current track record is so bad that it may well be that there has been no trend improvement in typical learning per child in India in decades. And in spite of that, budgets have expanded, programs have been launched. Okay, So, Professor Buzzkill, can I ask a question? Could you be more depressing, right? We start with cute kids, and everybody's happy about that. Then we move immediately to those kids aren't learning. Then we move to the fact that even more schooling isn't going to help them learn that much, so we can't just roll out the access coalition and just expand more schools and hope to be there. The current plans for quality improvement that are engaged in most countries and engage most of the attention and nearly all the budget are basically mimetic, isomorphic mimicry, and will fail, and are failing, to produce dramatically better levels, or significantly better of learning. Hence, we kind of need, and isomorphic mimicry is allowing this to persist and blocking, in some sense, what I would regard as a rebirth of modern education. So let me now start to the final crazy bit, and I think I'll be done hopefully in 10 or 15 minutes. I want to introduce a metaphor, another animal metaphor. I love animal metaphors because they stick in your head almost as good as rhymes. And I want to think of spider organizations versus starfish organizations, which is a business schooly kind of thing, right? What? Really? Come on. It is a business schooly kind of thing, whether you've heard of it or not. Meaning, by business schooly kind of thing, economists mean a certain thing. Anyway, so if you contrast, what does a spider organization look like? Well, it kind of looks like a spider in its web, right? There's really only one decision maker, and the rest of the web just exists to feed all the information into the spider makes the decision, and allocates all the resources, essentially. If there's a fly out there, the spider goes and gets it, but there's one brain, and everything else about the system of the web exists just to feed into the spider. Whereas a starfish is this really odd creature in that it actually doesn't have a brain. A starfish moves because different parts of the starfish, in response to their local environment, start pulling it one way versus another way, rather than all the little arms send a signal to the brain processes information and sends a signal to all the arms. Now, the beauty of a starfish system is that certain kinds of starfish anyway, if we cut them into 4 bits, we get 4 starfish, right? If you kill the spider, the web is worthless, right? So once you have a spider system locked into isomorphic mimicry, there's essentially very, very hard to change. Whereas a starfish system creates an environment in which kind of lots of different parts of the system are responding quasi-autonomously to their local conditions, which provides a much more robust system. So even if one leg is chopped off and taken away, the rest of the starfish kind of goes away, right? By the way, starfish has a central nervous system, and it is loosely connected. It just doesn't have a brain in the usual sense. So let me pursue that metaphor. And these aren't like necessarily better or worse ways of doing things. They're just different ways of doing things. And you have to think of it to yourself, what's the type of thing I want to do and how well adapted is it in the given context to the type of organization? So if you want to fight, there's a spider way of fighting a war, just have an army. And there's a starfishy way of fighting a war. It's called guerrilla warfare. Now, if you want to, fight a tank battle on the plains of Poland, which many people have wanted to do apparently over the years, an army is the only way to do it, right? On the other hand, when the most powerful army in the world went up in a jungle against an effective guerrilla warfare, I was American, I have to admit, I was a kid, we got our asses kicked, right? Because our spider way of doing warfare wasn't well adapted to the warfare we were fighting. And we can think, of lots of different things. So, I mean, and you can imagine contexts in which both are actually relevant, and in lots of these instances, both have survived over time in their comparative advantage niches. So it's not like cars have driven out railroads. Railroads are still super functional for doing certain things, but cars are certain functional for other things, okay? Okay, so. So why when I say rebirth of education, you might say, what the hell are you talking about rebirth, right? Well, because the original birth of education happened in the late 18th, late 19th, early 20th century, in which mass systems of government provided schooling displaced the informal community, private, and religious schooling that existed before that, and consolidated schooling systems into spiders, right? And when I say consolidated, I mean that really most of the modern systems didn't create mass schooling. They became mass schooling by absorbing the informal systems that were there. So in Japan, during the Meiji Restoration, the Meiji government realized it needed ideological control of the schools, and so they consolidated these different types of schooling that coexisted in Japan. 10 years into the Meiji Restoration, 60% of kids were in Meiji schools. Okay? Well, what was the net enrollment rate before the Meiji? According to the standard histories, it was like 0, because like none of these kids were in government schools, so they weren't really in school. In reality, the enrollment rate was 56%. So there were nearly as many kids in school before and after. It's just Meiji consolidated into a system they controlled and then called it school, right? And again, that's the history again after again. So we created a modern schooling system that was the result of the rise of secular nationalism, industrialization, and the rise of the bureaucracy, consolidated into effective modern schooling systems around the world, at least by the 20s to 50s. Okay. Then what happened is that in the era of colonialization and its aftermath, these systems, by the way, continued. So most OECD countries now have kind of spider-ish, the US being a dominant exception, spider-ish systems that are pretty functional, but they're all actually really stagnant in ways we can get back to. But what happened is the transplantation into developing countries had one of two outcomes. Some places actually adopted the spider model, ran with it, and did really well. Those places actually have the highest performing schools in the world, right? Other places, the transplantation interacted with wheat steak ability to produce dead spiders. Dead spiders filling, surviving through isomorphic mimicry. So they're dead in some sense functionally, but they're persisting. And they fill the functional space in some way, some important ways. So now, the important thing about this is that what was the spider mode of schooling good at doing? Right? We want to give the devil its due. If people did it that way, they did it that way for a reason, right? And there were two dominant reasons why the spider system was adopted and replicated around the world, and why nearly every country in the world, no matter how corrupt, how autocratic, has significantly expanded government-provided schooling, right? It's because spiders are great at logistics, and spiders are great at controlling ideology. And there's a whole chapter in this. So the fact that kids can't think independently is not a bug of existing schooling systems. It's a feature. In fact, it's defining feature. The systems were meant to suppress critical thought. That's what they were supposed to do, and they were good at it, right? In the sense that if you really wanted to perpetuate kind of a nation-state ideological affiliation through the schooling socialization process, you couldn't allow local communities to control schools. Because then if the local community's values disagreed with the values you wanted, you couldn't control them indirectly. You had to control them directly. Which is why so much of the emergence of modern schooling systems was the consolidation and dominance of pre-existing systems into a consolidated system. Okay, so so now we are where we are, right? We can't rerun history. We can't say, gee, it would have been great had we had a different system of schooling since the 1970s. Maybe or maybe not, but it's just not that relevant. But it also means that, there's a phrase, you can't cross a chasm of two jumps. And the reason you can't cross a chasm of two jumps is that if you fail on a jump, you can't then say, let's try that jump again, because you're at the bottom of the chasm and your legs are broken. Now your plan for getting to the other side of the chasm isn't a rerun of the jump. It's how do I get the hell out of, how do I get this rock off my arm, for one thing. Well, you, in the end, had to get your arm off the rock. So we are confronted with the school systems that we have, which have created a variety of political and other forces that have enabled their perpetuation in spite of not delivering very effectively on a learning agenda. And if we want to deliver on a learning agenda, we have to think, a map is only useful if it starts from where you are to where you want to be. A map from sort of London to Paris is not very helpful unless you're in London to start with. If you're not in London to start with, kind of you need the first part of the map, get me to London, right? Characterization, nearly all kind of plans for educational reform kind of unfortunately have this characteristic that they don't start from where you are. They start from where you wish you were and then say, oh, and then from there, here's, once you're in London, well then it just pop on the tube or the thing and there's a high-speed train. So there are lots of successful examples of high-performing learning schools in developing countries. There are lots of people out there running great schools, even great, in some sense, pretty good chains of schools. The problem, in some sense, is not creating ideas about how to do a better school, right? One of the features of schools is that you can walk into any city of India and you can find a really pretty good school, usually, and then you can draw a circle of about 4 blocks and find kids in a really crappy school, right? So it's not like no one in developing countries knows how to run a good school. Lots of people know how to run a good school, right? The problem is, how do you take these ideas and innovations and embed them in an ecosystem such that these scale and become the dominant outcome rather than a unusual outcome? So my proposal is that we need to worry more about the ecosystem within which schools operate rather than how individual schools operate. So I want to go one level of abstraction up, because a lot of education reform focuses on what should happen in the school. Here is what a school should do to be a better school. I'm not worried about how, I'm worried about why. Why would anyone adopt those practices that you're recommending, and how would we know those practices work? Right? So rather than saying, I have the answer for how schools should operate, or how schools should teach learning, at what age they should learn, what tongue they should be taught in, what pedagogical practices should be, I want to think, and this is how economists think, I want to think, what is the ecosystem in which the pedagogical processes that work emerge as the endogenous outcome of the operation of the system? Okay? Does that make some sense? Well, if it makes some sense to most people, that's the best I can hope for. So my characterization of an ecosystem that would produce over time better learning outcomes is a system that has these kind of characteristics: open, locally operated, performance pressured, professionally networked, technical supported, and flexibly financed. Those would be the 6 characteristics of the system. And those characteristics are interactive and have to work together, in the sense that, when you have a toaster that doesn't work, right, you can change the wiring of the toaster, but if the toaster isn't plugged in, it continues to not work. So for any electrical device to work, there has to be a circuit that completes. Now, you can have I emphasize that you can have lots of different ways of designing a toaster so that the circuit's complete, but you've got to make sure the pieces add up to a coherent toaster. Okay? So, there's purely private markets for instruction, unsupported by government private markets for instruction, have some but not all the characteristics of a high-performing Starfish system, right? But you would have to align those characteristics to make that as a system work. But you could create a Starfish system around locally community-controlled schools, or around charter schools, or around, there are all kinds of descriptions of the system, but you want to think of describing the system in terms of its constituent bits of how do you become a school, who gets to make the decisions about how the school is operated, who and how is the performance of the school evaluated, both internally and externally by outsiders. How are the teachers who are in the system embedded into networks of other teachers, right? Is it professionally networked? How are the teachers technically supported? How did they get their training? How do they renew their training? And is it flexibly financed, meaning do we actually have a way of financing this system such that we can produce both social equity and high-performing schools? Meaning, can we get poor kids into good schools while not running the school system in a way that every unit that every school spends is completely determined by somebody in the capital? Okay? I have other slides, but I'm gonna skip to the end. So the first thing is we got to get from schooling goals to learning goals. The first step has to be we have to recharacterize what it is that we wanted from the system to be what we wanted all along. No one ever really had schooling goals. Schooling goals were always instrumental, right? Second, we need to think of how we move from the existing dead spider systems that are kind of filling the ecosystem into ecosystems that support performance-driven schools and teachers, right? So the ecosystem is supportive of that rather than resistant to that. I want to emphasize that I don't know how to do this. I also want to emphasize that you don't know how to do this. I also want to emphasize that probably no one really knows how to do this. This is a demanding task, right? It's not as if I have a recipe for how to do this. I think I am pointing in roughly productive directions, but this transformation will be difficult. But I do know that one of the things you should do is you should start from where you are. You need to start from what exists in the context that I am that will allow me to move forward towards this goal in a productive way. Okay? So let me just conclude with, it's not mutually oppositional. Kids can be cute and they can learn too, and we really can succeed in moving from an environment in which schooling is the exclusive and only focus to a rebirth of education in which kids actually emerge from the schooling process ready for the lives they will face. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lant. I'm going to offer a few comments to get the discussion going, but not take up too much time, as I'd like everyone to have time to ask questions. Actually, to introduce myself, my name is Akshay Mangla, and I just joined the faculty of the business school. And my work is actually on the primary education system in rural India, and I look at the politics of education. And so I'm speaking from the perspective of a political scientist. I'm not an educationist. And so I found it, quite alarming to read about the poor learning outcomes. I was aware of them, but the degree to how bad it is comes out in the book. And the main problem laid out is there's a persistence of poor learning, largely drawing on data from India. And this is notwithstanding so many efforts by the government in support of education, expansion of schooling near universal levels, but basic learning remains woefully inadequate. And I would suggest for those of you who suffer from seasonal depression, read this book now, because that's the most depressed you'll be for the rest of the year, I guarantee it. Especially the first half, maybe not the second half, but certainly the learning side. And I find the problem as characterized in the book as both alarming and hard to disagree with. One might say, well, aren't these schools providing some other benefit to children? Aren't they getting social skills and civics? Aren't they developing as citizens? And having visited close to 100 primary schools myself across North India, apart from singing the national anthem, I'm not really sure that even citizenship is being taught in these schools, especially if one observes the persistence of casteism and gender inequalities at many of these schools. And the kind of experience that girls and Dalit children have hardly form the basis for engaged citizenship. And so I must agree with Lant here that no matter how much we want citizens to grow out of the school system, they must be literate and numerate as well. And so getting at the mechanisms of isomorphic mimicry, this sort of disaster and camouflage, as I think of it, I actually think a really novel part of this book is how interdisciplinary it is. It's actually drawing on a lot of other disciplines, sociology and political science. And so to understand the persistence of ineffective school systems, the book veers into the terrain of sociology. And there's an incentive, first a political incentive for governments to expand schooling, which is really to control the ideas of citizens which makes up the ideological fabric of nations. This is not some benign purpose to spread education, but really it's about control, and governments can't contract this control out to others. So with that argument in place, why do poor forms of organization develop? Well, here the book draws on the concept of isomorphic mimicry put forward by some sociologists, and according to that idea, governments look around the world, they see that the OECD has done certain things, so then they adopt those things, at least on the surface. And importantly, they use that adoption to justify their activities, and they invest further. And these investments, in fact, are part and parcel of that mimicry. So it's kind of a self-referencing sort of thing. But given that Lance veered into the domain of social science, of sociology and political science, I want to suggest some alternative explanations that may not be at odds with the one given in the book, but I think might help shed some further light, at least on the Indian condition. And while it's not a book about India per se, it draws heavily on data from India. And so I think we need to engage seriously with some thick questions regarding the persistence of poor learning, which relate to the persistence of inequalities in Indian society itself, related to caste and gender. And to get at these questions, I want to draw upon an anecdote that the book starts off with. So at the very beginning of the book, it talks about an experiment going on in a village where MIT researchers went in and found that children weren't learning very well. And they brought in the school headmaster and asked the headmaster to explain. This was in a public gathering, and here I'm quoting from the book. After the villagers expressed their poignant disappointments about the consequences for their children of their lack of learning in school, the school principal was asked to respond. He said, "It is not our fault. We do what we can with your children, but you're right. You are brutes and donkeys. The children of donkeys are also donkeys. We cannot be expected to teach your children. They come from your homes to school stupid, and you cannot expect that they will come home from school anything other than stupid." So the interpretation given for this sort of incident is really that teachers have tremendous amount of power in Indian society. Local communities have no authority over them. They know that as government servants they're not going to get fired, and they just have impunity. And while I agree that the power of teachers plays an important role here, one has to consider the quote-unquote community that government primary schools are increasingly serving. Not just in rural India, but in other parts of the world. It's no longer the sons of upper caste wealthy groups, but in fact lower caste groups, girls. And one can't imagine school teachers speaking to the parents of upper caste groups who demand better education in the same way. And in fact, in my visits of government primary schools, I observed persistent casteism within the classroom. And so one has to wonder what connections this has with student learning. In fact, one of the interesting things the book finds is that a major reason children drop out is because they're no longer interested in studies. It's not necessarily that they have to work or do something else, but they're not enjoying the experience of being in school. And in fact, the entire system of expansion of schooling in India is actually inscribed with casteism. So to get a scholarship, to get a free uniform, you first have to identify yourself as a member of a lower caste group in the school building, or you have to be a girl, and this can create resentment among other groups. And these experiences may even be shaping how children are experiencing schooling, and it doesn't surprise me that many decide to leave the government school system. So when we characterize the problem of schooling as one of school expansion, it's a sort of development problem. And if one looks closely, the problem in India is kind of not just developmentalist, but this sort of language. I wonder if we're not perpetuating the same language that governments use. Because the problem of getting kids into school is not just a problem of expansion, but it's actually a problem of desegregation. And this brings me to another point. So if you ask parents in rural India why they send their children to private schools, you often hear, well, the government teacher is never there, there's no schooling happening, and so on. But if you go beneath the surface some more, you find parents admitting they don't want their children sitting with lower caste children. They don't want their children sitting with poorer children. And often I even hear the euphemism peer learning, that my children will learn from other peers who are more like them and they'll get better that way. And so even this notion of learning from one's peers can really be a euphemism for not wanting to rub shoulders with those who are disadvantaged. And actually, if you look at the Right to Education Act right now in India, the major conflict is not about getting schools equipped with all the inputs, but it's about private schools having to take in a certain percentage of poor children into the schools in urban India. And that's the main source of contestation. And in fact, in one school I remember in UP, in a government school, the principal referred to the students in the government school as khane wale bacche, children who eat. And padhne wale bacche are the ones who go to the private school. So there's almost a caste system being built into the education system itself, which is not to deny any of the main points of the book. But I wonder if we cannot also draw upon the sociologist Bourdieu, who said that education is not just about ideology, but it's also about the reproduction of social distinction. And in much of rural India, and I would say even in the United States, schooling is one mechanism by which groups seek to obtain social status in their communities. And by the way, in my work in India, I interviewed about 165 teachers and only one sent her own child to a government school, which tells you a bit, if the service provider herself won't avail of her own service, what does that say? Certainly you don't want your children sitting with the other donkeys, right? So now just getting at the solution, and I'll kind of speed up here, about Starfish organization. I like that the book is not advocating any particular form of organization. It's really about guiding principles, and there can be multiple forms. And these principles, as were laid out, you want openness to new entrants, autonomy at the local level, performance pressure, and so on. Though I wonder if this focus is not still on the formal institutional design, and that if only we got the design right ex ante to be in alignment with the goal of learning, that everything would work out. But which I don't think is completely incorrect. There's a lot of formal institutional problems. But what about the informal, undesigned aspects of institutions, like norms, leadership, the tacit knowledge that actually gets innovative organizations to work, and organizational culture more broadly? And aren't these expectations and behaviors built over time? And so how can we sort of create an ecosystem, just given that reality? And so I wonder, as a last point, when we talk about this in terms of a language of organizational adoption, innovation, and scaling up, are we not ignoring the sort of political reality underlying that this is not just about mimicry and the problems with it, but the entrenched political interests, that once a system is developed, there are people who gain a lot from having it maintained the same way. Mimicry might be one way to gain broad social legitimacy, but you have clear interests. So in the Indian school system, schools actually double up as election booths. This is where elections take place, and teachers are the election booth operators. As a politician, you have virtually no incentive to fire a school teacher. Why would you fire the person who's collecting votes for you? And as a parent, which party will you go to complain about a teacher, given that both rely on teachers to get votes? So I wonder, how can we break with the current political scenario in India that reinforces the sort of isomorphic mimicry that goes on? And I'll just end with just some patterns that have emerged in India that I would be curious what Lant thinks about. One is the central government's clearly gotten more involved in education, right, and has invested a lot more, for better or worse. Arguably, this is belated, but still has increasingly put its paws into education. Secondly, there's been an attempt to decentralize, right? There's been the growth of, or at least the formal decentralization of authority down to village level panchayats and so on, who should be having some say over schooling. But alongside this, you see the rise of the concentration of power within state governments. And almost a backlash against decentralization, you have state governments kind of taking power into their own hands. So decentralization, you see, is actually just stopping at the level of a province, which is the size of major countries. So I'm just curious from a policy perspective, where ought we to target our ecosystem for starfish organizations? Should it be at the center, the state, or is it the sort of interactions between the two that we ought to look at? So with that, I'll leave it to Lant if he wants to respond or not to any of that, and would love to have some of you ask your questions.
Why don't we take,
Yeah?
why don't we take 1, 2, 3 questions?
Okay, so we could do, oh, okay. So we'll take these 3 first, and then we'll start with that one after that.
Yeah, sorry.
My name is Akshay. I'm a biologist. Since the term isomorphic has been repeatedly mentioned here, I just wanted to add to that. There is a term called anamorphic, indicating 2 different organisms can look similar, but they have undergone different paths of evolution. So we use the term anamorphic. Anyway, going back to the education, from my experience, I had my grades from kindergarten to 5th grade only in a rural school. or from any town. At that time, only memorization was very much emphasized. So now you are talking about conceptual, but not in my time. So now we learn something like how much is 17 times 19? How many people in the audience would tell instantly what is 17 times 19 without using your calculator? But the people in my time were learning. When I came to this country to do my PhD, I went to the professor to buy some tweezers. He bought it from a company and he was selling to students. And he said, Kanchi, that each pair of tweezers is just $5, 50 cents. How many you want? I said 6. It is a calculator. He said, why do you need a calculator to multiply 5.5? So I was somewhat puzzled. Because then another experience is there was just recently a manager of a store standing next to me at a bus station. And I told the person that I have been living in this country for 25 years. When you become 35, then you don't look that old. Are you 70? I said I came to this country at 34 and I have been living here for 25 years, and the store manager telling, you don't look that old. Are you 70? I asked the same question when I went to India, the same question. A fourth grader, and the person said the correct answer. So, different experiences, and besides that, I have taught in India. I have taught 11th grader and 12th grader plus undergraduate. It was a composite college. But I was lucky to teach in an exceptionally good school, where the students were very, very, what I call something comparable to Harvard in USA. That was the kind of school in my state where I taught. But the conceptual, I think it is just starting. And I can give my own example. When I took one of the exams in biology in PhD, for one particular question, I thought I knew the answer, but I couldn't write it. I didn't know how exactly. It asked the class, most Americans, they didn't know the answer. It took me 10 days to mentally to arrive at the answer. Because I knew the subject. I knew, but I didn't know what the answer was. Mentally went on analyzing because I never gave up. I never gave up. Mentally think it flashed. So that kind of education is needed, that I agree. But now only it is starting, because when I went back to the same college where I taught before, now I see the faculty teaching in that aspect. Because it varies.
I think we should either get to a question or we should start taking the
So
next
what I'm
question.
telling is this kind of conceptual,
Yeah.
it is just starting in India.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we have the next question? And can we keep them as kind of short and questions, preferably?
I agree with what you addressed the problem, but I disagree with the solution in the sense that I feel like you need to have some level of centralization in this. For example, in changing learning goals. If you don't change learning goals, but you have experimentation, then you're going to get kids who are just really good at rote learning. And then once you achieve that, then you have to make the jump to conceptual. So I agree that you need localization, but I also agree that you do need some top-down things like changing your 10th standard boards. And I feel like that is a bit more of a political issue that can't just be solved by that. So anyway, just want to get your thoughts.
My first question is very similar to this. So one of the paradoxes that often affect large and unequal societies like the US, Brazil, or India is that those regions that often have the most serious problems and need the most are also the same regions with the least institutional capacity to face and solve those problems. And that often means that if you take all the money of the world and put, for example, some areas of Brazil or probably India, we can be reasonably sure that nothing will happen or very little will happen. And one of the ways in which people try to tackle and solve these problems is actually to build a hierarchical structure in which you do intervene in that area and do the job for them while they can do it. So even if we agree with your vision in the short term, wouldn't it be most effective or even desirable to start with some form of spider organization to get things going? That's the first question. The second question, very, very quickly. If you were appointed Secretary of Education of one of these countries that you mentioned, I know you said that you don't know exactly how to solve these problems, but what kind of advices would you already give so that we can already start maybe looking for a desirable path to get the solutions quickly?
One last question.
So this is really brilliant when I hear you speak about it, it's very depressing also. But what is the reaction of government officials? I imagine that you presented it to government officials in India. Because when when I look at the higher education debate about rankings, and we all know that rankings are not the be-all and the end-all, but the excuse always from India is, oh well, the criteria for India is very different from higher ranking criteria in the rest of the world. Is that similar in primary education? Are these just, they're not willing to accept these? Because these are darn dire data. So that's my first question. And the second is, okay, so the primary education system, okay, bad as it is, at least there's some infrastructure there. Can you leapfrog with all what we know now? Leapfrog into some other better way of doing it. At least it's there. That is this. In your view, sort of echoing the question, if you were Minister of Education, what would you do on such a massive scale that would make a difference?
Okay, so first of all, I am proposing an unbundling of functions across tiers. So I'm not proposing decentralization. You notice when I say locally operated, performance pressured. The performance metric has to be centralized, right? And then you allow local operators in the context of a level playing field metric of measurement. So this is a table of okay, here's all kinds of things that would need to happen in a system, and what you want to do is allocate responsibilities across these tiers of government. So too often the debate is is everything central or is everything local? Whereas really what you want to do is pull apart these functions. So curriculum design stays quite high, center and state, evaluation stays high, and then operation gets pulled out. So I'm not, everything, so decentralization mostly just decentralizes crappy systems, right? Okay. Second, this kind of fantasy, this idea of yours that hierarchical things can remediate regional inequalities is a fantasy that has persisted for decades, but it's a fantasy. It doesn't work. The education inequalities have not been remediated by vertical systems. I have a paper called The Illusion of Inequality that we show that basically public systems have exactly the same equalities within schools within the public system. So I think the idea that you start with a hierarchy and that the federal government's going to make the schools in Alabama better because these Alabamans can't handle their own schools. I mean, in the U.S. we've never succeeded even in trying that, but it just doesn't work. You may be able to create some star schools here or there of the federal system in Brazil, but I think until Brazil actually said, let's actually turn a lot more control and a lot more pressure on the municipal mayors, you had the same disjunction. You had a few good federal schools, some mediocre state schools, and then huge heterogeneity of the multiple municipal schools. And Brazil has moved almost whole hog towards, giving up on the fantasy that the federal government was going to remediate these regional differences. So I agree that it's a commonly made argument. I think it's mostly and almost entirely wrong. Back to kind of what I would sort of do first. So one of the things, and this is the realm of sociology and political science, but one of the things is, before I tried to change what people did, I would get established some sense of what the goal was and metrics towards that goal. So, one of the key things of any change process is turning a condition into a problem. They say everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. Well, maybe now with climate change, but, and there's a reason for that, because the weather's a condition, right? So you talk about it because it affects your life. So kind of low quality, have you been here all along?
Yeah, I'm sitting there and
Oh, okay. It's like, okay.
Camouflage.
Yeah, it's like, wow. So one of the first things that has to happen is you have to turn low learning levels from a condition that people kind of passively accept into a problem that they believe they can act on. The second thing I would do is, and I am an anti-Big Bang reform guy. I'm old enough, been around, seen all kinds of reforms in all kinds of sectors. And the problem with most Big Bang reforms is it's like, you know, if I'm invading some some guy's kingdom, I don't go attack the castle first thing. The castle's what he's going to defend the hardest and where he's got his most resources. I'm going to like carve off some outward thing that he doesn't care that much about and have success there. And then I'll maybe carve off another thing. So what I would do is first I would authorize some experimentation. I would create a performance metric. I would get rhetoric going that this isn't a condition, we can do better. And then I would authorize some innovators. I would get some guys demonstrating that success is possible in our context.
Like the charter schools here?
Exactly, like charter schools, like community schools, you know, within the context. So we don't have to privatize to have success. We can have success if we change the conditions of the conditions in which teachers are operating in the following ways.
Would these still be the exception to the rule then?
But new rules are consolidations of successful exceptions, right? You don't change rules by changing rules. You change rules by creating practices that are successful and having those practices become the new rule. So again, in my mind, too many reforms want to sit in the Capitol, think up what the new rules will be, and then tell the spider what the new rules are. The essence of a Starfish system is that you got to create the conditions in which the rules will emerge from the practices that are successful against the metric that you are maintaining successful central definition and measurement of, right? Does that make sense? And that, to some extent, I don't take on the teachers' union right off. If I take on the teachers' union in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, straight off, I will lose. I will fail right off, and I won't even get traction. But if I just say, look, you guys continue with what you're doing, but I'm going to allow this to happen, right?
How long is it going to take? Like,
It's going to take a long damn time.
I mean, can we afford-
But so first of all, right now, you know, most of you probably haven't had the privilege of driving with small kids in the car. But when you do, there's a constant refrain, are we there yet? Are we there yet? How long till we get there, right? Well, the answer is right now, how long is it going to take is forever because we're going backwards, right? If India's schooling is getting worse, how long is it going to take before schooling gets good? Well, forever. We're still in reverse, right? So in the book, I calculate kind of at their current pace how long it would take to even make a student standard deviation improvement, and at the current pace, it's either negative or on the order of centuries. So when I talk a decade-long reform program, where you're going to get going with one part of it, then you're going to get going with the next part, and that we're starting to see scaled practices of success a decade later, I think that's super ambitious. Like that's wildly ambitious and optimistic. And more optimistic than that is sorry, I have a paper where I have a term from, you know, what we do is we say, look, let's look at the fastest that the fast improving countries are improving their scores, and let's try and go from negative or zero to there, right? Beyond that, setting goals higher and faster than that, I think just sets yourself up for failure, right? So anyway, so I'm what I call strategic incrementalist. I want to do incremental changes with strategic objectives, right? Acknowledging that my incrementalism is only going to add up to the strategic changes in the longish run. But if we could be making progress on India's learning agenda or Pakistan's learning agenda and have demonstrated paths to success within a decade, I would be thrilled. You know, it took us, and I say we because I was part of coalitions, and we could get to the story another time, but the fact that India even did PISA took us 6 years. Took us 6 years to create the political conditions in which India felt pressured enough about its performance that it felt it even had to do PISA, that then has created further political pressure so that we can now corner our way towards acknowledging the condition, turning the condition to a problem. So, but it's taking a long damn time. But, you know, if you don't do it that way, I think you're doomed to fail.
Okay, well, with that, I think we're actually at time. So I want to thank Lant so much for coming. And also want to thank all of you audience members, and just letting you know before you leave that the next session of the education series is October 4th, and we're having Abhimanyu Singh from UNESCO come and do an India-China comparison. Why is democracy not working, apparently? So please come for that. And
There's some event the 27th, the 10th anniversary of the
Oh
South
yes,
Asian
oh
Initiative.
yes. So the 10th anniversary of the South Asian Initiative. So we're having a sort of retreat for the faculty and all, but there'll be a sort of welcome event in the evening. I think a chaat welcome event, is it?
So the chat party is on Wednesday
Oh,
for
okay. I
students
got it all confused.
here in the Siege's concourse.
Yep.
And then on Friday we have a lecture with Nick Dirks, who's the Chancellor of UC Berkeley. He's speaking on South Asian Studies, and that's at the Loeb House at 5 o'clock. And there's lots of flyers here you can take.
Great, thanks.
And by the way, if anybody wants the book, send me an email. I'll
Oh,
send you the page
yeah.
proofs even before it's ready.
Yes.
And then you'll want it so much you'll buy it anyway.